Hi, everyone. Hold on to your horses and tighten up your britches. Today, I have yet another set of shocking stories that are sure to make your head spin. You might even learn the truth about something that makes it impossible for you to sleep tonight. So get yourself comfortable, grab your favorite drink, and cozy up with that subscribe button. Thanks. Now let's get into the stories. It was 2010, and I was working a summer job at Yellowstone National Park. That year, I was helping with conservation work, and this particular week, assigned to trail maintenance. That's when I had my encounter. I clearly remember that it was a hot day, and I had decided to take a break by going down to the river and having lunch there. The park is home to many rivers, including the Yellowstone and the Snake Rivers, but my favorite is the Firehole River. This river is also a favorite spot for fly fishing. I also find it interesting that the water runs warmer there, since most of the flow from the park's geysers empties into the river. Overall, I find this section to be beautiful and serene. When I arrived at the river, it wasn't too crowded either, which I was happy about. Mainly because often when you have your park uniform on, you tend to get a bunch of questions from park visitors. Now that's fine because I love helping people, but sometimes it's hard to get your lunch eaten. And on that day, I was starving. So while I was sitting there relaxing and eating, I noticed something moving along the bank on my side of the river. At first it looked like a deer, but then I noticed how low to the ground the thing was moving. I watched as it moved along the bank for about 20 minutes before it stopped and looked right at me, just as if it had known that I was there all along. And this is when my heart started beating faster, and I realized that what I was looking at wasn't anything from around here, like not of this earth. The creature's head was long and narrow, with ears that stuck out in front of its head instead of on top like most animals, at least the animals I'm familiar with. Its eyes were large and dark brown in color, while its nose seemed to be flat against its face instead of sticking out like a snout would do. It sat there for a while, staring at me without making any sounds or movement. I watched as its eyes stayed focused on me, but blinking every 5 seconds or so, which started to make me feel really strange, like it was connecting to me or trying to send a message or something. Eventually, I was able to shake my head and break from our mutual stare, and I decided to try and get a better look at it by moving closer. But as soon as I did that, the thing turned around and ran away. It moved fast, so fast that in just a few seconds it was gone into the grasses along the bank of the river. I then decided to get up and walk over to where it had been standing and look for tracks or anything it might have left behind, but I couldn't find anything. After that, I decided to head back up to the main trail since my break was over and I still had work to do. I started thinking that it was probably just an apparition or something from being tired and hot and hungry, so I just got on with my day. So I got on with life and work, but then a few days later, I had another encounter. This time it happened during the day while I was on patrol in a truck. It was hot and dry that day, so there weren't any clouds to block the sun. While driving along one of the main roads through the park, I noticed strange movements off to the side. It's interesting how you come to instinctively know what's normal and what isn't in the park. I quickly realized that there was an unusual flash of movement from the grasses along the road. I stopped my truck to get a better look and saw that it was one of those creatures crawling on its hands and feet through the grasses. It moved fast, like really fast. It went from one spot to another without ever standing up or running. I sat there watching this thing crawl around for a while before there was this noise and flash of light, and it just disappeared right in front of me. After that, I was on high alert. I was convinced that these creatures were watching over the park, keeping an eye on things, possibly even following me. To be honest, I was starting to get scared that I was losing my mind. I started to see them more often after that, crawling along the roads or moving through the grasses. I didn't say anything about it to anyone because I'm not sure they would have believed me. So I just kept it to myself. It wasn't until recently that I started talking about my experiences with other rangers, and they told me that others have seen these creatures as well. They've nicknamed them the crawlers because of how fast they move on their hands and feet without ever standing up. I'm not sure what they are or where they come from, but I know that I'll never forget the sight of those dark eyes staring at me. I'll never forget how fast they are and how they can disappear before your eyes. So, if you ever go to that park, you just have to keep an eye out for them, because I firmly believe that they will definitely be watching you, too. My life completely changed, and essentially all came crashing down the year I went hiking and camping at Yosemite. It was late May of 2008, and I was depressed. I had just broken up with my girlfriend and basically felt like I was at the end of my rope. So I decided to go on a road trip from San Francisco all the way to Yosemite National Park, which was essentially a straight shot east. If you've never been there, it's quite literally in the middle of nowhere. There are no cities within miles of it, and basically only one main road that leads into and out of it. I arrived about noon on a Saturday and immediately set up camp in the Upper Pines campground. I had all the stuff I needed, and I was ready to relax for the next few days before going back home on Monday. The campground was pretty empty. Maybe 10 to 15 other campsites were occupied. I started a small fire and began cooking lunch when I noticed some people setting up a tent about 50 yards from me. It wasn't odd since there were plenty of open spots, but it would turn out that this spot would be important later on. As I ate my food, an older couple with 2 dogs then arrived and set up their camp right next to me. They seemed nice enough, so we exchanged pleasantries as they unpacked their stuff, and then after they finished, I watched as they walked over to the trail to start hiking. I then finished eating and decided to take a walk myself. So I walked along the trail for about 10 minutes, taking in the sights, when I saw something odd off in the distance. It looked like something standing on top of one of the rock formations that jutted out from the ground. At first, I thought it was just an optical illusion because it was so far away and in a place that would be nearly impossible to get to. But as I continued to look at it, it seemed to be moving closer and further away at the same time. It also looked like whatever it was stood on 2 legs instead of 4 like an animal would. Whatever this thing was disappeared behind another rock formation, reappeared again, and then disappeared completely. This made me incredibly curious, so I decided to speed up my pace towards it. I got closer to it in about 10 minutes and looked towards where I had seen it, but saw nothing. It was at this point that I realized how quiet it was all around me. Usually when you're in nature, you hear birds chirping or the wind blowing through the trees, but it was completely silent here, except for my own breathing. I decided to continue walking down the trail to see if I could find whatever this thing was. So I kept going until the trail ended and opened up into a clearing with another trail branching off. I'm pretty sure I had seen the couple from before going down that way. As soon as I took a few steps onto this new trail, I heard something slam into the ground behind me, like a rock being thrown. I turned around immediately and scanned my surroundings, but didn't see anything out of place. No branches moved or leaves rustled. Nothing was moving. After a few seconds, I decided to keep going to see if whatever it was I had seen before had followed me. I didn't see anything, so I kept walking for about 5 minutes when I came across a small clump of trees growing tightly next to each other. As I stood there wondering how they had come to grow that way, I noticed something on the ground just beyond one of the trees that looked like a stick, but it was white in color, which was really intriguing. So I walked closer to it, and when I got close enough to pick it up, this creature that I can only describe as a monster appeared from behind the tree right next to me. It was tall, at least 8 feet. It had gray skin, black eyes, and no nose. Nothing that you could call a normal mouth either, just an opening where the face met its neck. It also had long fingers with sharp claws instead of hands. Shockingly, the creature was so startled by me that it let out this screeching sound, and then it ran away. I was too shocked to move for about 20 seconds, but when I snapped out of it, I booked it back to the campsite. The old couple from before were just returning from their hike as I arrived back at camp. They asked me if everything was all right because they said I looked like I had seen a ghost. I blurted out all about what happened, and the couple seemed genuinely concerned for me. I'm not sure if they were concerned at that point because they believed me or because they thought I was having some sort of an episode. The husband offered to sit with me for the rest of the night if I wanted him to, but after a while I felt much better, and so we all relaxed and continued about our respective business, just sitting around and relaxing at our sites. And then at around 9:30 at night, we both heard this loud noise of something slamming into one of the trees behind us. It made a noise that even shook the ground, which scared the crap out of everyone. The dog belonging to the couple started barking in the direction of the noise and wouldn't stop, so the husband got up to see what was going on, and there, behind the trees, was that same thing I had seen earlier, and it started throwing rocks at him and his dog. We could even hear them hitting from where we were. The husband ran back to his campsite, and I watched as this thing chased him back, but it continued running towards the trail that we had all been on earlier. I then watched it follow that trail until it reached a bend, and it disappeared into the forest. We never saw it or heard from it again after that. The husband and wife packed up their things instantly, though, said goodbye, and drove off in their car. I stayed the rest of the night by myself, and I didn't sleep a wink. I still don't know why or how I even did that. The next morning I packed up my stuff and left as quickly as possible. Needless to say, I have not been back to Yosemite since then because it completely ruined the experience for me. And no, this thing wasn't a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot or whatever people want to call them. It was something else entirely that almost looked like an alien with gray skin and black eyes. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't normal at all. I've been camping and hiking all over the country, and I've never experienced anything like this. Whatever it was, it wanted us out of that campground, and it did everything in its power to scare us away. Grand Teton National Park holds a secret that I'm not sure many people know about. I mean, it's not really a secret in the sense that you can't find out about it, but more like I'm not sure how many people know of its existence. In one section of the park, there's this small lake, and it's fed by a small stream. The lake isn't very large, and the shoreline is heavily wooded with pine trees. There's also a trail that sort of runs near it, but other than that, it's pretty secluded from the rest of the park. So, I was hiking along this trail in 1992 when this all happened. I was walking along, minding my own business, when I heard something splashing in the water, loudly splashing off to my right. And when I looked over, I saw something that I could not believe. I even took off my sunglasses and put on my regular glasses to see it more clearly. But it was really there. There was a creature in the water, and it was covered in hair. Long, shaggy brown hair, and the shape of the thing looked like it was part human and part animal. Obviously, I had never seen anything like it before. The thought even crossed my mind that someone was filming a movie or something. Basically, my brain was trying to rationalize what it could be, but ultimately I was so shocked that all I could do was stand there and stare at it. Fortunately, the creature didn't seem to notice I was there, which made me feel a little bit safer. So soon my emotions turned to being curious, and I wanted to get a closer look. I slowly made my way over to the edge of the lake, being careful not to startle it or let it know I was there. And when I got close enough, I could see that it definitely looked like some kind of large dog, and it had 2 arms and 2 legs that were covered in thick fur. The creature's body was also furry, but the face was hairless. And I could now see that it had 2 large eyes, and that they were staring straight at me. I stood there for a few minutes, just watching the creature. It was clear that it was not afraid of me one bit, and I wasn't sure what to do about that. Do I stand still? Do I move? Finally, I decided to leave it be and continue on my hike, thinking there had to be some logical explanation for this. So I was walking along when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, came this blood-curdling scream that sounded like it was coming from a human being. It was so loud that it actually made me jump. I stopped for a moment, trying to figure out what it could be, and then a few minutes later came another scream that sent shivers all over my body. And I was actually starting to get scared at this point, but I kept on going because I didn't know what else to do. But then as I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something that made my heart stop. There in front of me was the creature that I had just seen in the lake. But now it was out of the water, and I could see that it was standing on its 2 legs, and it looked like that's the way it always walked. And it was also covered in something that looked an awful lot like blood. I stood there not knowing what to do when the creature suddenly lunged at me with its sharp claws extended. I screamed and I ran as fast as I could in the opposite direction. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, and then I hid behind a tree just trying to catch my breath. I was so scared I was shaking all over. After a few minutes, I peeked out from behind the tree to see if the creature was still there, but it was totally gone. Thankfully, I made it away safely, and I have never seen that thing again. But ever since that day, I can't help but wonder what it was that I saw. Was it some kind of animal that had never been seen by mankind before? Or was it something else entirely, like a mutant of some kind? And why was it bleeding? I didn't really notice any wounds, but they could have been covered up by fur. I eventually came to think that the reason I saw it was because it was injured, like the way you only see some animals if they're sick or injured and not acting like they normally would. There's no real way that I'll ever know for sure about any of that, but one thing is for sure. That experience left a very lasting impression on me. Well, more than a lasting impression, really. Thoughts of what happened actually consumed me for a few months afterwards, but eventually they started to dissipate, and I eventually got over it. Well, mostly, other than a few nightmares that still tend to creep into my dreams every once in a while. I'm hoping that writing this to you will help me get past those, too. My fingers are crossed. Say a prayer for me if that's something you do. Thank you, everyone. Hey, Lilith. A week or 2 ago, I heard a story on your channel about a creature I recognized. It's something I've witnessed myself in New Mexico. For a while, I thought I might be insane or hallucinating, but now I know I'm not. I own a decent-sized ranch in the northwestern part of the state. I have a few hundred head of cattle and twice as many chickens. One of the last true ranchers left in the area. I inherited the property from my father, and he inherited it from his, going all the way back to the early 1900s, before New Mexico was even a state. Even way back then, there were stories of monsters and demons living in the desert. Heck, everybody's heard of the chupacabra, but I never paid any of it any mind, thinking that it was all just a bunch of crap. Well, my opinion has changed. You see, about a month ago, some pretty nasty things started happening out in the area. A man that I was good friends with discovered 3 of his dogs torn apart at the edge of his property. Those dogs were tough mixed breeds, too. He used them for elk hunting up north. Whatever killed those poor pups sure wasn't a coyote. I kept my own dog Cruiser close to my side after that. And then a few nights later, we had our own incident. It was late in the evening, and the sun had just gone down. I was in Albuquerque all day and had gotten back late, but I still had a few things to take care of before going to sleep. And that's when I heard a commotion coming from the hen house. Sometimes a coyote would come sniffing around and occasionally manage to finagle its way into the hen house, usually at the loss of 1 or 2 of the hens. But as I ran up to the building, I could hear an extreme disturbance coming from inside, and the sounds of hundreds of chickens going berserk. As I threw open the door, I could tell something was seriously wrong. Every hen in the building, about 400 of them, were in an extreme state of panic. I heard the sound of wrenching metal coming from the far side of the building, and I ran to investigate. I was greeted with a scene of chaos. A huge gaping hole had been torn into the side of the house, like something sharp had just sheared through the sheet metal, creating a 10-foot wide gap. Dozens of hens had been torn to pieces. Chicken wire, wood, and feathers were all there in a bloody, twisted mess. Now, I'm a rancher. Raising and slaughtering animals for food is part of what I do, and agree or disagree, it's a vital component of this country's way of life. But even my heart broke a little at the way these poor girls had perished. Wasteful and needless. Whatever had perpetrated this had done so for the sake of just taking lives. We fixed up the damage as best we could, and I asked a few of my hands to stay in our guest house for a few days until whatever this was blew over. I wish that had been the end of it, but there was one last incident. A few nights afterwards, sometime in the middle of the night, I was woken by my wife shaking me violently. She said that Cruiser, who was sleeping at the foot of the bed, had jumped up snarling and took off out of the room and down the stairs. We had a doggy door for Cruiser. He was used to being his own dog, and he was outside right now, barking up a storm at something out there in the darkness. Cruiser was a clever dog and well-trained. If he was alarmed, then it was for a good reason. More importantly, he was my closest and most loyal companion these last 12 years, and I'll be damned if he was going to face whatever he was out there facing alone. Hardly stopping to think, I grabbed my 12 gauge from beside my bed, and like a fool, I ran out into the New Mexico night, with no shoes, no light, and no idea what I was going up against. Before I had made it outside, Cruiser's barking had stopped short. I ran out onto the front porch, and I couldn't see him anywhere. The immediate area was illuminated by lights from the house, but beyond that was complete darkness. I ran to the perimeter of the light, yelling "Cruiser!" repeatedly, in a near state of panic. Suddenly I heard his barking again, and this time it was way out in the darkness. I took off, heading straight for the barking, gravel and stones cutting into the bare skin on my feet. When I got to the spot where I thought I heard Cruiser, I heard his barking again, coming from a different direction. I ran towards it, but before I could reach him, again, the noise changed directions. Another 2 or 3 times this happened, each time taking me further and further from the fading lights of the house. I sat, panting in the darkness, and I knew that something was very wrong. Cruiser hadn't barked in several minutes now, and I wasn't completely sure which direction led back to the house. As I was trying to catch my breath and consider my options, I heard something slinking around just outside my field of vision. And then, the most absolute horrifying moment of my life occurred. From right behind me, not 10 feet away, came a human scream. It was my voice, me, screaming "Cruiser," exactly as I had been doing for the last 10 minutes. I turned, raising my shotgun to fire. In the instant before pulling the trigger, I could make out a black shape at least 10 feet high. The area around it seemed brighter in comparison, as if it pulled the darkness into itself. I fired, and in the brief muzzle flash I saw something shooting straight for my head. I felt an impact, and then nothing. One of my field hands found me laying out there in the dark about a quarter mile away from the house. It was a feat of luck that he did, for even a group of 6 men could have easily passed me by in the dark. I was still out of it, and they carried me back to the house and laid me down. The next day I woke up to a bad gash on my head and even worse news. My man who had found me told me that my wife had called them when I ran out into the night. When they came looking for me, they heard my shotgun blast and they followed the noise. He said there was nothing in the area where they found me, except for a pool of thick black liquid leading to a spatter trail going off into the desert. They also found Cruiser, huddled under a bush not too far away from my house, completely on the opposite side of where I had been looking. They could barely get him out from under, and he's still not 100% relaxed again. By the grace of God, nothing else has happened since, though it's only been 2 weeks. I've asked 2 of my hands to move onto the property permanently, and I contracted a security company to install 12+ security cameras around the ranch. I can confirm that there is something deadly out in the New Mexican desert. Call it a chupacabra, or a demon, or whatever, I don't care. All I know is that it's not just an animal hunting for food, it's evil. It toys with its prey, and it kills just for sport. Just be careful out there. Hi, Lilith. I started listening to your channel accidentally a few weeks ago when I was looking for something else. But after hearing some of these stories, I just kept listening. and now I've decided to share something that I've experienced. It's kind of a relief telling somebody because at the time it happened, I was really questioning what I heard and feeling like I should just be quiet about it. When I was in the Army, I spent a couple of years working at a military hospital. I had always intended on going into medicine, but at the time I only took the training for patient administration. Things were typically pretty low-key around there, and much of the time it just felt like an office job. I was stationed in San Antonio and was assigned to mostly work under one particular surgeon. There were times when I had to stay after hours to catch up on paperwork, and there were even a few times that I went in really late at night to catch up on things. I had a real insomnia problem at the time. I will admit, though, that it did feel creepy to be at the hospital late at night. Mainly the side of the hospital that I was on with the offices was especially quiet. There would be an occasional nurse or security guard come through, but that was few and far between. On the night that this all happened, I had gone over around midnight. It was November, and it was cold and snowy, and when I got to the hospital, I walked to the office area but entered through the back door that's reserved just for staff. The front receptionist door was locked since the offices were closed. So I went in and I walked to my desk, which incidentally was all the way by the front receptionist door, but like I said, that door was locked. Everything seemed normal, kind of creepy, but that was usual for that time of night. And so, like every other time I was there late, I turned on a podcast and I got to work. Notably though, since nobody was there, I wasn't using headphones. About an hour in, I thought I heard footsteps mixed in with my podcast. I paused it to see if it was part of the recording or if they were in the building with me, and sure enough, I still heard the footsteps. My first thought was that it was a security guard. They didn't usually come into the office area, but there are glass doors in the front, and they could have seen my light on and were coming to check it out. So I yelled out, "Hello?" There was no answer, but the footsteps didn't stop. So I started to walk over to check things out, thinking maybe they didn't hear me. I walked toward the common area in the office. The lights were off since I had never turned them on. I only turned on the light by the back door and the light by my desk. So the switches were right beside me. I flicked them all on. There was nobody there. But when I turned on the light, very noticeably, the footsteps stopped. I was starting to feel freaked out at this point, and the only thing that made my head not hurt was thinking that maybe one of the doctors had forgotten something. So, leaving the light on, I went and looked around. I didn't see anybody at all. I assumed that I had been imagining things. So eventually, I turned the lights off and I went back to work. But it wasn't even 5 minutes later when I heard the footsteps again. At this point, curiosity and adrenaline made me want to find out exactly what was going on. I also started to have the thought that it could be someone up to no good, and I should intervene. So I went back out to the common area, but this time I was really quiet and I didn't turn the lights on. I walked toward the direction of the footsteps, and as I approached, they stopped. I stood still for a moment, and then I heard the footsteps again, this time back by the office where I had just been working. So I walked there as silently as I could. The same thing happened. The footsteps stopped as I approached. I called out in a normal voice, but it sounded like I was yelling since it was dead quiet. "Is there somebody here? What's going on?" At that point, the door to the surgeon's office, which was right behind me, slammed open and closed. Now that is strange enough to be horrifying, but especially so because that door was always locked. I immediately started to feel this overwhelming sense of doom, and right then the temperature in the room dropped drastically. And at the same time, out of my peripheral vision, I saw a figure flash by with the sound of running footsteps. The sound passed right next to me, and I caught a smell of something like gunpowder. And then the sound and the smell became fainter and fainter. I was petrified. I had been there countless times at night, and I had never encountered anything like this. I made myself go over and look in the office of the surgeon. The door was unlocked, even though I had checked it out as being locked twice before. When I turned on the light, I saw glass shattered on the floor by the desk. It was a framed picture of the surgeon's family. Nothing else in the room looked to be disturbed. I instantly turned around and left the building. When I went outside, it was still snowing, and yet there was no sign of any footprints leaving the building. I couldn't drive away fast enough. That ice-cold fear that I had felt was indescribable. I never even said anything to anybody about it. Every time I tried to imagine telling someone, I thought for sure I would just sound like I was nuts. After that, I did stay late at the hospital a few times, but only if I wasn't alone. I was a county sheriff for a small town in Ohio when this happened. In total, I was there for a couple of years before finding another position closer to my parents' house. They were getting older and I wanted to be closer to home. At least, that's what I told everybody when I moved away. The reality of it was that I was moving because of an experience I had had on the job in May of 2008. I was called to a home regarding a complaint about some neighborhood kids. I didn't know the details, but I wasn't worried. This type of thing happens all the time, especially in smaller towns where kids don't have that much to do. Sometimes there's property damage that we need to report, but for the most part, it's just harmless pranks. I had a name, an address, and a message about crazy, evil, demon children, but that was it. A woman answered the door when I arrived at the house. I would guess her to be in her mid-60s. She was a nice lady, seemed normal enough at our first interaction, but she was terrified to go outside. She asked me to remove my sunglasses before she let me through the door, and I couldn't understand why until later. She told me that 3 kids had come to her door last night, all dressed up in old clothes, like they were Amish or something. She said that they pounded on her front door and claimed that they needed help. Their story was that they were lost and that they needed to use her phone. Of course, she opened the door, but the kids all just stood there with their eyes down, staring at their feet. They repeated their plea that they were lost and they needed to use the phone. She asked the kids where they were from, but they didn't answer. They just kept repeating that they were lost and they needed the phone. And then they asked if they could come inside. The woman told me it was then that she knew something was wrong. She didn't say how she knew, but she knew that she couldn't let them in. She said that she offered to bring her phone out to the porch for them to use, but then they said that they were cold and could they please come inside. The woman again said no, and when she went to close the door, all 3 kids looked up at her. She claimed that it was at that point that she realized they all had black eyes. Not just black irises, but the whole eye was completely black. She slammed her front door and locked it, but she said that as soon as she turned the lock on the door, there was instantly pounding on the back door. She looked across her house, and there were the kids knocking at her back door. She said there was no way they could have gotten there that fast when just a moment earlier they were at the front of her house. She ran to the back door and locked it before they could get in. She then went around to every window in the house, locking and pulling the shades. She then said that she ended up locking herself in her bedroom all night, saying that there was periodic knocking at her windows and her doors all throughout the night. But she was way too terrified to get up and look. I took her story down exactly as she told it, regardless of how ridiculous it sounded. She was convinced that the kids were some evil creatures from hell, but I reassured her that it was most likely a very elaborate prank. It wouldn't be too hard for kids to go to a costume shop and pick up some outfits and black contacts for a prank night. I advised her to look into getting a home security system and some cameras if it would make her feel better. At least she could have some peace of mind. There wasn't much else I could do. I didn't think much about the creepy kids until later that night when I stopped at a gas station to pick up a bottle of water and a few snacks. The gas station was pretty quiet, but that wasn't unusual for that part of town. Then as I got back to my car and closed the door, there was a knock at my window. It was a child, maybe 9 or 10 years old at the most, dressed in what looked like old Victorian-era clothes. I thought, great, I have a lead on the pranksters. But then when I rolled down my window, I felt this overwhelming sense of dread. I knew instantly something was wrong. The kid said that he was lost and asked if he could get in my car. My heart jumped in my throat. It was as if my body had sensed the evil. I didn't know what this thing was, this so-called child, but I knew it wasn't human. I asked the kid for his name and where he lived, but he just kept repeating that he was lost and asking to come into my car. It was almost like he didn't know how to say anything else. I told him he couldn't come in, but I could call his parents for him. And then he looked up at me with eyes black as night, and without changing the look on his face, he turned and walked off into the forest on the opposite side of the road. Once he reached the trees, he seemingly disappeared into thin air. I didn't try to follow him, I just knew that that would not end well, and I didn't want to find out exactly what that meant. Hey Lilith, something happened to me a few years ago that I have never shared with anybody else. I didn't want anybody to think I was crazy, but finding out about your channel and seeing some of the other stories here, I feel comfortable enough to tell you about it. This was back in 2015, and I was 16 years old at the time. Every year in April, myself and a few of my uncles and a cousin would take our yearly trip out to western Pennsylvania for trout fishing season. I hadn't missed a single trip since my first one 5 years prior. We had spent the days cramming into my uncle's Ford Explorer and hitting all the different rivers and streams that the area had to offer. The campground we planned to stay at had a creek that ran right through the center of it, but we usually fished that on our last day, when we were too tired to travel anywhere else. That creek had some exceptionally large trout in it, and I was excited to tackle it the next day. It was around 9:30 at night, and everybody else was worn out from a day full of fishing and drinking. Since I only participated in the former, I was still full of energy, and I decided I was going to take a walk around the campground before climbing into my tent and heading to bed. The campground wasn't very crowded. There was probably only about 40 people staying there this season, and everybody else was sitting around fires in their own little designated areas. I walked towards the back of the campground where it's more isolated. There's a trail there that leads deeper into the forest, and it runs alongside the same stream in the campground. I hadn't really done much exploring back that way, and I figured, why not? I had my headlamp anyway. I figured maybe I could scope out a good spot for the next day. I walked probably 5 or 10 minutes up the trail. It was a little bit spooky, but besides maybe an owl and a few skunks, I didn't hear much else in the woods that night. Eventually, I came to a spot along the stream where I could hear the water moving quickly. That meant that it was probably shallow, and I wanted to confirm in case I decided to cross the stream tomorrow. So I crept down from the trail to the shoreline. Once I got down there, I could see that it was indeed shallow, and I made a mental note. I didn't want to walk any further, so I just decided to sit for a few minutes and enjoy the night air and the sound of the running water. After about 10 minutes, when I had had enough, I thought I saw my headlight catch the reflection of something across the stream. I quickly ruled out the possibility that it was a raccoon or a skunk. It was too big, and the reflection had caught something 5 or 6 feet in the air. I was sweeping my lamp left to right against the shoreline, and that's when I saw it. A sickly gray hand was wrapped around the trunk of a young tree. I saw the creature emerge from behind the tree, emaciated to the point that its ribs were sticking out from its abdomen. A pair of pallid, bony arms extended from either side, bent at these strange and horrifically odd angles from the elbow, like they'd been attached backwards or something. The creature had a single yellow orb of an eye which almost took up the width of its entire head, and I couldn't see any discernible nose or ears or a mouth. Trying to maintain my composure, I began inching backwards towards the trail. Me and the creature just stood there staring at one another probably for a minute or so, until it suddenly dropped to all fours and began charging me from across the stream. I didn't know what set it off, and I didn't pause to think. I just turned on my heels and I climbed back up to the trail, and then I ran at full sprint back towards the campground. As I fled down the trail, slamming into low branches and stumbling over rocks, I threw several glances over my shoulder. The creature stayed hot on my tail, never more than a dozen feet behind. It made absolutely no noise as it ran, and it darted along the trail, pursuing me. Not even the crinkle of a leaf or the slap of its hand on the dirt path as it loped along behind. I was running blindly along the trail, just praying that I was heading in the direction of the campground, when I saw the bright orange glow of a campfire up ahead. I leveled my head and I charged forward. Whipping tree limbs and thorns were cutting me in a dozen places. I burst from the edge of the forest into the clearing, surprising a group of campers relaxing around a fire. They had a small radio playing, which is probably why they didn't hear the racket I was making. I turned, scanning the edge of the clearing with my headlamp, looking for that creature, but it was nowhere to be found. It had just vanished somewhere on the trail behind me, not more than 20 feet away. The campers were pretty upset, and a few were yelling at me to get out of their sight. I tried explaining what had happened, that something had chased me, but I didn't say exactly what I thought I saw. But they probably thought I was just some drunk teenager. Not knowing what else to do, I just returned to my campsite, found all my uncles and cousin fast asleep. I spent that night sleepless, alone in my tent. And the next day I opted to just stay behind and start packing up, not wanting to go anywhere near that spot on the stream again. Years later, I still can't explain what I saw or what it was. As far as I know, there's no animal on this continent that bears even a remote resemblance to that thing. I guess there really are strange and unusual things in this world. Things we might not ever be able to explain. I was spending the summer at my aunt's house while my parents were working to get ours ready to sell. I think I was around 12 or 13 years old at the time. My aunt lived in Las Vegas, which is about the most uninteresting place for a kid of my age. Also, it seemed pretty dusty to me, and I got so hot that I could hardly stand it. My cousin Jess was home from college for the summer, and she was my saving grace. Despite our age difference, she would hang out with me and take me fun places whenever she had time. She even convinced my aunt to let her take me to see the Grand Canyon that summer. It would be a 4.5-hour drive through the desert to get there, but Jess said it would be totally worth it. We had planned to stay 2 nights at Grand Canyon Village and do some tours of the rim. That was all we had planned since the weather forecast looked like it would be too hot to do much hiking. Still, I was looking forward to it since it would be my first time visiting a national park. Unfortunately, we got on the road a little later in the day than we had originally planned. Jess had to work that morning, and it turned out that her shift ran late. It didn't matter much, though, because we were still on track to reach the canyon well before dark. The road was flat and the landscape varied between 2 shades of tan and dusty red. It was an abysmally monotonous drive. The only time we stopped was to get gas at a tiny gas station that barely looked open. In fact, the only reason we stopped was because we saw a sign that informed us that there wouldn't be another gas stop for 200 miles. Jess picked out some snacks and sodas. I looked around for the bathroom, but I couldn't find it, and I had to ask the cashier. She just pointed towards an unmarked door at the back of the store. The door led straight outside, and at first I thought it was a joke, but then I saw a porta potty behind the dumpster. I was pretty grossed out, but I didn't know if I could hold it for another 200 miles. I watched as a man exited the porta potty just as I was walking towards it. He stopped me, and he said, "It's gonna be dark soon. You best be planning to be indoors by then. There are strange things out here after dark. Things in the sky that shouldn't be here." Right away, I figured he was just some sort of a lunatic, and I just hurried myself into the porta potty. I met up with Jess back in the store, and she handed me a soda but told me not to drink it right away since she didn't know how long it would be until we reached the next restroom. I didn't mention the man in the porta potty or what he said about the weird things in the sky at night, but I did ask Jess if we were still going to reach the park before it got dark, and she said we would. As luck would have it, we hit an armadillo about 75 miles after leaving the gas station. Jess tried to swerve around it, but she couldn't. Though I don't think we ran it over completely, it was still a bad enough hit to flatten the front driver's side tire. We couldn't get any cell service either to call for a tow truck, and not one single car passed us. Jess then looked over at me and asked if I knew how to change a tire, which I took as a pretty bad sign. But not all was lost. Jess and I did figure it out how to change the tire, and after about an hour, we were back on the road. The problem was that the delay changed our timeline quite a bit. Now, we would most definitely be out here after dark, especially since we couldn't drive fast on the spare. Jess could tell that I was a little nervous, and she reassured me that we would reach the park in an hour max, and that she wouldn't hit any more armadillos, especially now that we didn't have another spare tire. I laughed a little bit, but the warning of the man from the gas station was still stuck in my head. And then I heard a thud, and it sounded just like when we hit the armadillo, but this time it came from the roof of the car, like something fell on us. Jess pulled the car over. I actually begged her not to get out, but she wanted to see what fell on us and if it had damaged the car. I couldn't see anything from where I was sitting, but I definitely heard Jess scream. She jumped back in the car immediately and locked the doors. I asked her what she saw, but she just kept saying it was nothing. But then I saw it come into my view from through my window, and it was flying in the sky. It looked like a dinosaur. It's the only way I can explain it. It was like one of those flying dinosaurs. It had eyes like a lizard or maybe a snake, and its body was covered in scales. I thought I could even see a few others higher in the sky, but I can't be certain since at this point the darkness was starting to cover us. Jess took off instantly, and thankfully we arrived within the hour and we got ourselves into our hotel room. The next day, we straight away got the tire fixed and then continued on with the trip. Jess never mentioned it again, and since I was a kid, I just held it all in and I didn't bring it up, which actually still affects me to this day. Needless to say, Jess and I never talked about the encounter again, and we never told anybody what happened. At least, I know I didn't. I mean, what would people say? No one's going to believe that we saw some type of a dinosaur in the middle of the desert, in the sky. I know it sounds crazy, but that is what happened. Please tell me somebody out there knows what we saw. I had a solar winter camping trip planned. I know it sounds like a crazy thing to do, but winter camping can be pretty fun if you're prepared for the weather. Plus, I had gotten some new camping gear for Christmas, and I just couldn't wait until summer to try it out. I was no stranger to winter camping, but it had been a while since I had my 4-season tent out. I had organized to head to a hike-in campsite at local state forest lands about 5 miles from the access road. The trails weren't groomed that time of year, so I had to snowshoe in. It was pretty tiring, but the one nice thing about winter camping is that you can haul all of your gear in on a sled. No backpacks are needed. There were no other cars in the parking area, and there were no signs of any other campers. Of course, this isn't unusual in the dead of winter since there are not that many people who like camping when temperatures get below freezing. I finally got settled into my campsite, and after packing down enough snow to set up the tent, things started to look pretty nice. According to the map, there was an easy snowshoe trail nearby along a scenic river that I was excited to get to the following morning. It's not unusual for the forest to be a bit quieter in the winter. Snow muffles the sounds, and yet I hadn't noticed any wildlife on my hike in. I didn't think it was too strange at the time, but looking back, there was definitely something wrong right from the get-go. I had just started to boil some water to cook dinner when I heard something flying overhead. A shadow passed by, but I couldn't see what it was coming from. But I could tell that it was big, maybe an eagle or a great horned owl. I tried to find it, but I didn't see where it went. My campsite was surrounded by trees, so it didn't feel all that unusual to have a large bird flying around. The rest of the evening was then uneventful. I settled in for the night and was toasty warm in my sleeping bag. I was just about to drift off to sleep when I heard a strange sound. Well, the sound itself wasn't strange, but it was the location. It was the sound of a bird flapping its wings, but it sounded like it was just outside of my tent. So I got my headlamp out and I started to unzip the tent to chase whatever it was away. I didn't see anything immediately, so I slipped on my boots and stepped just outside the tent to look around. I didn't want to spend too much time outside since it was so cold. I pointed my light towards the forest. I didn't see anything in the trees, but then something reflected back off the light, and it was closer to the ground. There was no mistaking it. They were eyes. I didn't see the creature when I first looked over there because it was standing between two trees, very camouflaged. The only thing that gave it away was its eyes. If you didn't look close enough, it even looked maybe like the outline of a small tree amongst the others. But it wasn't. I could now see that it looked like the dark outline of a man, but with wings. The eyes were about level with mine, and I knew it wasn't human because our eyes don't reflect like that. This looked like the reflection you would see when you shine a light on a cat at night. But it was staring directly at me, but it didn't move. I screamed at it, hoping that I would scare it off, but it just stood there, motionless, staring back at me. I didn't have any weapons on me except a small utility knife, and I was now starting to worry about protecting myself if I needed to. Maybe I could bludgeon the thing with my fuel canister. I don't know. I couldn't hike out of there until the morning, and plus I would have to walk right past the creature to leave. I didn't want to go back into my tent because then I wouldn't be able to see what it was doing, what was going on, but there really wasn't a better option since I wasn't at all prepared to be out there in the cold. So that's what I ended up doing. I went back inside and I laid awake all night, but the creature didn't bother me again. I looked for signs of it in the morning as I was packing up camp. There were no tracks anywhere, but I did find an assortment of small animal bones, organized into a ring around the area where my campfire had been. I'm not great at identifying bones, but I would guess they were maybe raccoon or fox-sized. After seeing that, I didn't stick around to look for anything else. I packed my gear in record time and booked it out of there. As I was leaving, I heard the sounds of those wings again. But again, I couldn't see anything in the sky. And I didn't stay to look for anything either. I don't have any explanation for any of this. I've never told my friends or my family. Nobody would believe that I saw some bird-man creature in the forest. There isn't a great ending to this story either. I never figured out what the thing wanted or what the assortment of bones meant. It didn't exactly try to harm me, and it knew where I was that entire night. So I figured that if it had wanted me dead, I would be dead. I don't know if I trespassed on its territory or set up camp right where it lives or what. I can say for certain that I'm never going back there. So if it was trying to scare me off, it did a damn good job. My wife and I went on a vacation to Alaska last month to celebrate our 5th anniversary. I know you're probably wondering why Alaska. Well, we wanted to see the Northern Lights. We both thought it would be something we could tell our kids about one day. Our trip did not go as planned, but luckily we made it home safely. We had a great time in the beginning. We ate great food, met some of the locals, and got some amazing photographs. We went ice skating. I did fall once, but only once, so that was a small bonus. On our first night there, we could not see the Northern Lights. And then again on the second night, no luck. We knew it would happen soon since usually you can see them 4 out of 5 nights. We were having a great time anyway. On our third night, we hiked out to the spot that some locals told us had the best view. They told us to be careful and to pay attention to our surroundings. One man even told us that only locals go to the spot and that maybe it wasn't a great idea. We found the local spot with no issues and cuddled up on a warm blanket to watch the sky. Not only were the Northern Lights in full view, the moon was also full. It was amazing. We finally got what we had come for. We sat for a while, talked, and took some great pictures, and we also listened to the wolves howling in the distance. Once we figured it was time to head back, we packed our blanket, took a few more pictures, and walked off hand in hand. As we were walking, we heard a howl, much louder than before. It was close, and I could sense the fear coming from my wife. We held hands a little tighter and tried to hurry our pace along a bit. The area we were walking through was not heavily wooded, and the trees were pretty spread out, so both of us were basically power walking. We had to be really careful, though, because neither one of us was used to walking on snow or ice. I wanted to run. We heard the howl again, even closer, but I couldn't leave my wife behind, obviously. We could hear something crunching through the snow behind us, and it was still some distance off, but it was closing in. We still had to exit the woods and cross over an unpaved road to get back to people. My wife asked me if we could hide or maybe run. I didn't think hiding was a good idea since animals can pretty much smell and that's what they're driven by. And I didn't think running was a good idea either because if one of us fell, we would be easy prey. We still had at least a 5-minute walk to the tree line even though we were walking really fast. And the crunching and the growling was getting louder. In that final growl, it did make us run. We didn't turn and look, we just ran. My wife was in the lead and I was trying to keep up. We zigzagged through the trees, jumped over branches and rocks, and somehow stayed running. We didn't fall, but I realized we may have zigzagged and thrown ourselves off of course. I yelled at my wife to turn slightly to the left and keep running. We did. I heard a howl now right behind me, and I finally decided to look back. I shouldn't have. The thing that was running after us was running on 2 legs, and it had a long snout like a dog, and its mouth was full of sharp canine teeth. It was snarling and gnashing its teeth at me, and the thing's whole body was covered in fur, and I could see its muscles rippling as it ran. I picked up my pace as much as I could. I was honestly thankful that my wife was ahead. I couldn't live with myself if the worst had happened. I jutted to the right some to keep it on my track. I heard the crunching of the snow behind me, and the thing growled again. I zigzagged again to the left, and I realized that I could see the tree line. I put everything I had into that last sprint, and I prayed that my wife had already made it through and had kept running. I just kept waiting to feel a tackle or a bite. I didn't want to look back again. I did not want to see who was close to me. I just wanted to make it through the trees, and I knew that it was still going to be behind me once I made it out. But then maybe somebody else would see us and help. I finally broke through the tree line and I could finally see my wife. She had passed over the unpaved road and was still running. I hit the road and kept going too. I did not hear anything behind me now. I took a quick glance and I realized that it had stopped at the tree line. It was just standing there, watching us. It let out a final howl and it turned back into the woods. I still ran. We made it back to our lodging and immediately moved our flight up. I told my wife what I had seen. She thought that maybe my fear caused me to see the 2-legged creature instead of processing what was really chasing us. I think that the strangest thing about all of it was that when we went down for breakfast, the old woman who told us about the local spot looked really surprised to see us. I've been wondering if she's seen what is out there, but I'm not going to ask and find out. We saw what we set out to see. It was beautiful. The aftermath, though, I just don't know what to say. Be careful out there. There are definitely more things in the world than we want to believe. My parents both grew up in Ohio, but moved to the East Coast for better job opportunities, shortly after they got married. I was born about a year after. Every year, we made a trip back to Ohio to visit and stay with my grandparents for a week or two. It was something I looked forward to. Personally, though, I prefer the bigger cities to the part of Ohio where they lived. It was pretty rural and not too far from the West Virginia border. They had a little ranch house that was decent, but it really got packed when we stayed with them, especially after my 2 siblings were born. The only summer I ever missed going to Ohio was my junior year when I went to Italy for a school trip. And I felt bad because about a month later, my grandfather, who we called Pawpaw, passed away. But the rest of the family got to see him and spend time with him, so that was some consolation. About a week after his death, my parents told us that we were all heading back to Ohio for the funeral. It was about a 6-hour drive to their house, and I rode with my younger brother in my car, and my sister rode with our parents. We arrived just after dark, and after eating a dinner with Mama, everybody knocked out pretty hard from the drive. The next day, there was a little service at the church my grandparents went to, and then the actual burial was at the town cemetery, about 20 minutes away from their house. After that, Mama was having people over for a reception and lunch. I met a lot of their friends from the area, and because it was very rural, people seemed a little different than me, but everybody was nice. My siblings and I were pretty beat from the drive down and the service and the burial, so we ate and then we went outside to try to decompress. Mama and Papa owned a little over 8 acres that backed up to a decent-sized hill that wasn't quite a mountain. The hill was covered in oak trees and it looked dense this time of year. Papa had a deer stand hidden in there somewhere, and so we decided to troop out to it and just reminisce a little to get some peace. None of us had been to the deer stand since we were kids, so it took a bit of floundering around the woods before we found it. It looked like Papa hadn't used it in a while and no one wanted to climb up and test it. But we settled down on the ground underneath and just chatted. We 3 siblings didn't always get along, but Papa's passing brought us a little closer together. My brother Michael was talking about wanting to go on the same Italy trip I had just gotten back from when we heard a sort of a hollow thud. We looked around because it was a weird sound, and then it stayed silent for a while, and then we went back to chatting. But not soon after, there were 4 more quick thuds in quick succession, and to me it definitely sounded like rocks hitting trees and bouncing off. My sister Carrie stood straight up and said she wanted to go back to the house. I could tell the sounds spooked her. We were about a 10-minute walk into the woods. I tried to stay as calm as I could as I stood up, but I realized then that the woods were actually a little too quiet, quieter than normal. No birds or squirrels were jumping around, and that's usually a sign that bigger predators are in the area. Papa taught us that when we were little, but I wasn't sure if my siblings remembered it. So trying to stay chill so Carrie didn't get any more freaked out, I started ushering us back the way we had come and talking loudly about whatever I could think of to distract my sister. My brother Mike was starting to look freaked out too, and then he stopped abruptly and he pointed and he said, "Bear." But the word came out more like a question. And then the thing he was pointing at, we could see, was hunched over in a red-brown color, which didn't look like any bears around here. It was also huge, like bigger than a cow. And as we stared at it, it straightened up and looked. I realized it was bipedal and looking straight at us. But where I expected to see a bear's snout and ears, the face was human-like. Still covered in hair, but there was a human nose, and I could see the shape of an ear. It was about 100 feet away. Carrie took off running immediately, and Mike and I did too. We were completely freaked out and booked it back to the house and right inside. Mama must have seen us from one of the windows because she pulled us aside and asked what was wrong. Carrie was too scared to talk, but I explained what we saw. Kind of embarrassed as I said it because I knew it sounded crazy. But to my surprise, Mama waved it off. She said Papa always talked about seeing those things out in the woods. Apparently there were 2 to 4 of them, but they were usually further back up on the hill. She said, "I wonder if they know he passed and came down to pay their respects." That sounded absolutely crazy to me, but as I've gotten older, I wonder the same thing now. Mama passed away 2 years later, and after that day, I talked to her a few more times about what we had seen. She never saw them herself since she didn't go out into the woods much, but she talked about Papa coming into contact with them a few times and giving them space. He was eventually convinced that they were Bigfoot, but Papa was so even-keeled that he never worried about it or cared to report it. After Mama passed, my parents and their siblings ended up selling off the acreage and the house. So I never got to go back to find out if Papa was right. But somewhere near the West Virginia border of Ohio, there are hairy creatures with human features hanging out in the woods. Okay, so what I'm about to tell you is going to sound crazy, but I'm not the only person who saw this. So I was hanging out with my friends at Goshen Pond up in New Jersey near the Pinelands. My friends and I were camping. Everything was going great. We went hiking, kayaking, swimming, and we were having a blast. Well, around maybe 7 or 8-ish that evening, my friends and I were cooking dinner and having fun. The sun had just set, so it was pretty dark, but we could still see. We were laughing, joking, messing around, and whatnot when this awful smell just appeared. It smelled like someone had just broken a few rotten eggs. The stench was unbelievably strong, though. We actually even worried that maybe the meat we had brought had spoiled, but when we smelled it, it was fine. And then we realized it was so quiet. You know, like how in the movies when something bad is about to happen and there's no noise, like at all? Well, that's what this was like. It actually sent chills down my spine. And then deep in the distance, we heard what sounded like a scream. It was super high-pitched, but it just didn't sound right, if that makes sense. It made my blood run cold. And even now, when I think about it, I just feel sick and scared. My friends and I just stood around our campfire staring at each other, and then one of them suggested it could be a wild animal, a coyote or something, a dying cat maybe, but they looked as disturbed as I felt. We scanned the tree line and began to put away all the food just in case it was a wild animal. We'd everything mostly packed up and we were starting to put the fire out when we heard what sounded like drums beating. That's hard to describe too, but that noise generally got louder and louder. We looked around trying to see where the noise was coming from and what could be causing it. We thought that maybe it could be other campers out there. But then we saw what we saw. And oh my gosh, it must have been at least 6.5 feet tall. And I swear on my life, my friends saw it too. And it's going to sound crazy, but I couldn't make this up. It looked like some kind of a demon that had huge wings like a giant bat, and then these awful glowing red eyes. And even though it was a little harder to see, I could make out its hocked legs and scaled skin, like a lizard. And its face, honestly, was the weirdest part. It had the head kind of like a goat, and this elongated snout and horns sticking out of its forehead, but it had the ears of a bat, and it had a really long tongue too, because when it opened its mouth to screech again, I could see the sharp canine teeth and the tongue. And then, of course, the glowing red eyes. And it just hovered there in the air, and I don't know how long it stayed there. It sure felt like an eternity, but it couldn't have been longer than a few seconds. My friends and I were terrified, stared at these awful eyes, didn't know what to do, and then the thing just screeched, and it flew away. We ran to our tents to grab our phones, and though it only took about 5 seconds, the thing was already gone. My friends and I just looked at each other. You could tell what we were thinking. Maybe we had had too much to drink? But then when we looked at each other, we all knew that we had seen the exact same thing. We remained quiet, and we stayed in the same tent together for the night, but not one of us was able to sleep. The next morning, we did talk about it. We did see the same thing. We know it sounds crazy. It was literally a flying goat, bat, demon, but it was real. We drove home early that day. We cut our trip short. And on the way home, we passed some other campers leaving the area. So we decided to ask them if they had seen or heard anything strange that night. And they said that they had also heard wild animals howling throughout the night, but not much else. My friends and I don't like to talk about this much. It happened a few months ago, like back in mid-August. We thought about talking to the authorities about it, but what could we tell them? That we were drinking and we witnessed this goat, bat, demon thing fly off into the night? I mean, we hardly believed each other. Forget about convincing the authorities what we saw. We tried to look it up online, but we didn't really find anything. And eventually we just agreed to stop talking about it. Or maybe we actually just stopped without talking about stopping. Anyway, anybody we did ever talk to about it treated us like we were crazy, or they tried to convince us that we hadn't really seen what we saw. That was, if they didn't think we were just outright lying. Since that night, I think we've all been a little more on edge than usual. I don't like to stay out after dark anymore, and my friends and I avoid wooded areas entirely. We no longer camp, fish, or hike unless it's sometime in the morning or the afternoon, and if the area is wooded, we avoid those activities entirely. It's strange because the creature didn't seem like it wanted to hurt us, but it just looked evil. Anyway, thanks for having me on, I hope we'll be able to get some answers after this, because I know that what we saw was real. So there have to be other people out there who have seen it too. Hi, Lilith. I hope you get to read this on your show, because otherwise I'm at a bit of a loss right now for what to do with this information. I've thought about going to the authorities with what we saw out there in the woods, but I think they might just think we're insane or making a joke. There's no question about it. This is potentially dangerous. There's a creature out in the woods that endangered my friends and almost killed me. Something has to be done. I'm a logger living in Northwest Oregon. I've lived up here my entire life. These woods are my home. My father and my grandfather were loggers with the same company. I remember watching them cut down trees. Rather than go to ball games or do Boy Scouts, I sat in the passenger seat of 18-wheelers lugging logs across the state. When the time came to take over the business from my dad, it was one of the happiest days of my life. My friends celebrated with me, and I even got to hire a few of them. We began to turn a decent profit, and we became known in the area for being the best logging company in the Pacific Northwest. It was the 4th of July, and all of my guys were off and celebrating. I was planning on meeting them when we heard from a private landowner. He was the wealthy type, and the kind that liked things done on his timetable. We didn't usually give these guys the time of day, but whenever I did a job for them, he paid double the price, and sometimes extra. His wife made us lobster rolls too, and he had an extra Range Rover that he didn't want anymore. Yeah, imagine that. It was free to me for doing some light arborist work. All this to say that when he calls, we answer. It looks like all he wanted was a few of us to act as fallers. He had some old trees that he wanted us to take down. An easy job, super straightforward, just a bit tedious. So my buddy Todd and I set to work and ended up cutting well into the night. He was getting a little pissed off, but I reminded him of the payday. So we decided to just make camp for the night and pick up first thing in the morning. That way it would be out of our hair and we could just keep it moving. I pitched a tent for us while Todd made the fire, and even though we missed the festivities of the day, we had a few beers around the fire and grilled hot dogs. Now I've known Todd since we were kids, and he always knew how to make a bummer situation a little bit more palatable. We spent a few hours telling jokes and drinking until we decided to get some shut-eye. The tent ended up being a bit warm, so I decided to sleep out under the stars. It was a beautiful summer night, and the stars were always more visible out here in the woods than in my backyard. So eventually, the sound of the wind and the swaying of the trees sent me to sleep. I woke up a few hours later, though, in the pitch dark. The stars weren't out anymore, and the wind was no longer blowing in the trees. Everything was very still. It felt like it happened in an instant, like I blinked, and this stillness set in all at once. In the distance, I listened, and I could hear a roar, a loud, blood-curdling roar echoing through the forest. All my hair stood up on end as I reached for my flashlight, and when I clicked it on, it was super bright. It beamed directly into the deep woods, and the roar happened again. And that's when the breeze came back. I crab-walked over to the tent to kick it so Todd would wake up. Slowly, he unzipped the tent, and he's white as a sheet. I know just from his face that he has also heard the roar. We know what bears sound like, and we know how to handle them. Todd actually liked to call them giant raccoons, but this sound was different. In hindsight, we were scared, but also curious. Only a very large creature could make a noise like this, bigger than a bear. In the next moment, a tree fell about 100 yards from camp, and it was a big, old tree. Probably something we would have cut the next morning. It slammed into another tree, and it fell that one too. Todd looked me dead in the eyes. Slowly, he raised his flashlight in the direction of the fallen tree, and he turned it on. We were right. The creature was huge, much bigger than a bear. It was on all fours like a bear, and it had that similar giant head of a bear. But this creature had no fur, just bare skin. I could see its muscles shifting under its tough skin, and whatever it was, it felled 2 trees like they were nothing. The creature roared once again and turned in our direction. It stared into the glare of our flashlight, and in our shock, it came at us at a run. We looked at each other, and we both knew. We both did the only thing that our instinct knew how to get us away. We climbed a tree. Luckily, we got up there before the creature noticed where we went. Neither of us slept that night. It seemed like an age passed before the sun came up. We were up high in that tree, high enough that it must have lost our smell. But when we looked down, our tent and our camp was torn to shreds. That explained the noises we had heard that night, all night long. It looked like the whole pack of bears descended on it rather than just one large one. In the morning, we got down the tree and we got whatever of our stuff we could salvage. And then moving quickly, as quietly as we could, we jumped into our truck and booked it back to my place. I don't know what it was, but it could have killed us. Anyone who lives in our neck of the woods, you must be careful out there. No camping. Not until we know more about what's going on. Please, please be safe. I was a city worker in a tourist town on one of the Great Lakes. I'm not sure if I feel comfortable saying which one on here. I've never told this story to anyone before today, and I don't want anyone I know to think I'm crazy. I don't believe in ghosts or monsters or the supernatural, but I don't have any other explanation for what I saw. I was working on an old historic lighthouse. The city wanted to refurbish it and potentially open it to the public for tours, but it needed some electrical work done first, so they hired yours truly. Now, if you've ever done any work in old buildings, they can be a bit of a challenge. There's always something that goes wrong in one way or another, and I was having one of those days. I had a pretty busy week scheduled, so I wanted to get this lighthouse done by the end of the day, at whatever cost, and that meant staying late, well after dark. I never once had a strange feeling about the lighthouse or the surrounding area. People always talk about how they knew something was wrong before it happened, but I never got that feeling. I won't say it wasn't a little creepy to be working alone in this lighthouse once the sun went down, but I never felt anything bad. I should probably say a little bit about the lake I was overlooking. Without giving away the exact location, this particular lake is known for its bad storms and shipwrecks. Storms that seem to come out of nowhere. It can be calm here one minute and white caps the next. I was intent on my work, trying to get this thing done as quickly as possible, when I heard the sound of a ship's horn. This isn't a functioning lighthouse, and large ships don't typically come this way anymore. I looked out the window and I didn't see any lights out there on the water, but the sound of the horn was deafening. I knew I wasn't imagining it. I stared out the window for a moment. I know it was only a few seconds, but it felt longer. I was entranced. Suddenly, a thick fog began to roll in from the lake, and it crept across the rocks and all the way to the base of the lighthouse. It was insane how quickly it appeared, but this lake is known for changing weather. And then I heard the horn again. It was undoubtedly the horn of a ship, but as I said before, there were no ships on this part of the lake. I went back to my work. I was so close to getting this thing up and running, and I really wanted to be done with the project. And then I was interrupted again, but this time by a light shining through the window. It was blinding, and I couldn't see where it was coming from. For a moment, I was terrified it was a ship about to crash into the rocks, because the only thing in that direction was the water. The whole thing was a little weird, too. The unexplainable ship's horn and the sudden blinding light. I decided to head down the stairs and investigate what on earth was going on outside. The lighthouse only had the one window facing the lake, so I couldn't see anything facing land. When I got outside, the fog was so thick that I could barely see my hands in front of me. I heard the ship's horn once again, and this time I could pinpoint the sound coming from towards the water. I swore I heard a woman crying, but I wasn't exactly sure. It was like the fog had muffled the sound. I walked further towards the water, and I reached the rocks and I made sure to step carefully so I didn't misjudge where I was standing and fall in. The sound of the woman crying grew stronger, and as I got closer, it sounded less like crying, and now it sounded more like singing. I followed the voice. I don't know why. Looking back, it was a terrible idea, but that never crossed my mind at the time. I know I said before that people usually instinctively know when there's something wrong. I never felt any of that. The fog was so thick that I didn't see the creature until I almost stepped on it. It stopped singing when I reached it, and it had this human voice, but it was definitely not human. It was a little bald thing with pale skin and big silver eyes. I had never seen eyes like that before. It smelled of fish, and it had teeth that I can only describe as similar to a cat's. I pulled out my utility knife as soon as I saw its teeth. I didn't know what it was, but I didn't want it to come near me. I don't know if it was fear or anger in those big silver eyes, but it took one look at me and it leapt into the water. I don't know how else to describe it. It had legs and arms like a person, but it definitely was not a person. I never told anybody what I saw, not ever. I mean, how can you explain that to people? I'm convinced it tried to lure me out there with the sound of the ship and the light and the singing. I don't know what its end goal was, and I'm not sure that I really want to know. I locked the lighthouse up for the night and I decided to finish the next day. I didn't run into anything strange out there in the daylight, and I did walk down to that spot again where I saw the creature, and this time, there were no signs of it. Hey Lilith, I wasn't a believer, not for a long time. I'm an officer with the New Jersey State Park Police, and I cover the Wharton State Forest. I grew up around the Pine Barrens, and everyone knows about the Jersey Devil. I heard all the stories, but to me, that's just an urban legend. The Pine Barrens is considered one of the most haunted areas in the country. It's rich with history and folklore, and littered with abandoned ghost towns, the remnants of once bustling iron, paper, and terracotta industries. While the Jersey Devil may be the most infamous resident, he's hardly alone. This brings in a lot of self-proclaimed ghost hunters. On one afternoon, I responded to a call about a car accident near one of the abandoned towns. A car had driven off the embankment and crashed into a tree. It was a group of teens, and thankfully nobody was hurt, but they were absolutely terrified. Apparently they were snooping around the ruins looking for a ghostly woman who reportedly haunted the area. Instead, they saw something even more shocking, and they were convinced it was the Jersey Devil. They showed me some blurry pictures, several of a shadowy figure deep in the woods. It could have been a hiker for all I knew, although it appeared to be somewhat misshapen. They had a few more pictures of something flying in the sky that looked suspiciously like a big vulture. It was clear they believed it, but it's not the first time I've seen this kind of photographic evidence, and as usual, it was hardly convincing. Nonetheless, I listened as we waited for a tow truck. They could tell I wasn't buying it, and as they left, one of them challenged me to go check it out for myself, while the others warned me to stay away. It was getting late, but the ghost town was pretty close, and I decided to go have a look. Not for ghosts or the Jersey Devil, but to make sure the kids didn't damage anything. It's not uncommon to find graffiti and trash left at these places. The ghost town was a short hike off of an old dirt road. I hadn't visited this particular place before, and I have to admit, it was pretty creepy, especially in the waning sunlight. There was no town left, so to speak, just mounds of dirt and the scattered remnants of old brick mills and stone foundations overrun by foliage and trees. Everything looked okay, and as I was about to leave, I was assaulted by the smell of sulfur. And that's when I noticed the quiet that came over me. It was as if the chirping birds and the buzzing insects just disappeared. It was unnerving, to say the least. I looked around and something caught my eye. About 25 yards away, lurking in the forest at the edge of the ruins, was this shadowy silhouette. It was hard to get a clear look through the trees, but it did kind of resemble the figure in those pictures that the kids took. It looked like it was wearing a trench coat, or maybe a cape, and there was something strange about the shape of its head, like it was wearing a mask or a hat. I called out to whoever it was, and I started to make my way back to the ruins. The figure didn't do anything. It just stood perfectly still, not making a noise. I couldn't make out any face, but I could feel like something was looking at me. And then what happened next was the most bizarre and terrifying thing that I have ever witnessed. I called out to the figure again, and as I got closer, I quickly learned that it wasn't a trench coat. They were wings, enrobed around the figure, and they suddenly unfurled into a span of maybe 20 feet. For a brief second, I caught a glimpse of the creature. It had a skeletal head of a goat with horns, and its body was scaled like a lizard. And then it made the most inhuman, ungodly shriek before shooting up and disappearing up over the treetops. I stood there, frozen. Did I just see the Jersey Devil? I got out of there fast and I didn't look back. I jumped into my car and I sat there for a minute with my adrenaline racing. And now I knew why those kids were so scared. I got my head together and I started the drive into town. It was twilight at that point and I was on a dark, lonely stretch of road. I kept replaying the events in my mind, going back and forth between, was that or wasn't that what I think it was? And then an unearthly shriek pierced the air and snapped me out of my reverie. The same shriek that thing made before taking flight. And then something heavy landed on the roof with a loud thump, causing me to swerve. I panicked, thinking the Jersey Devil had come back to finish me off. And then I heard the sound of scratching metal as something was ripped from the roof. I glanced in the rearview mirror and I saw the emergency light bar clattering across the road in pieces behind me. The car shook as something again banged on the roof. I couldn't see what it was, and there was no way I was going to stick my head out the window. I don't know how long I drove like that, but it felt like forever. I heard that shriek again, and the car rattled as the creature took off. I could literally feel the weight lifting as I was able to gain better control of the steering wheel. I watched as the tips of the creature's wings passed briefly in front of my headlights, and then it was gone. I floored it back to the station, and when I got there, I noticed I was gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. Another officer came out and gasped, pointing at my car. I then got out and looked at the roof, which was shredded, and the light bar mounts were twisted and torn apart. The officer asked me what happened, and when I said it was the Jersey Devil, he laughed. I almost visited those kids to corroborate our experiences, but I thought it was best to just leave well enough alone. Even in my report, I stated that I had carelessly skimmed a low-hanging branch. The department wasn't happy, but I was too ashamed to tell them the truth, or at least what I thought was the truth. A few weeks later, another officer came up to me in private and said that he, too, had had an experience with the Jersey Devil. He never said anything about it because he was afraid of being ridiculed. That gave me a sense of relief, even validation. At least now, I know that I'm not the only one who has seen it. Hi Lilith. I've been a follower of your channel for a long time and have always loved your stories. I just never thought that I would have a story of my own to share until now. This incident happened the other night. I work the front desk at a small-town medical clinic in Western Maryland. Most of our patients are locals who sprain the occasional ankle or smash a thumb with a hammer. We hardly get any outsiders in town. The few who do are typically going to or coming from the nearby Savage River State Forest. I usually work the day shift from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., but the overnight girl had just gotten married, and her new husband were on a honeymoon for 2 weeks. The clinic asked me to cover her shift, and since I didn't really have any good reasons not to, I agreed. The clinic was run by a doctor who lived in an attached home to the clinic. If there was ever a real emergency, we were instructed to call her into the clinic. Otherwise, the patient could just see one of the few nurses who were on the payroll. Usually there were only 4 or 5 people in the clinic at a time and only 2 at night. I had never actually had to call the doctor in for an emergency until the other night. This night had been as quiet as the rest of them at first. It was only me and the one nurse who was hanging out with me at the desk. She was watching something on her phone, some weird show about people getting married at first sight or something, when somebody burst through the front door. It was 2 Maryland state troopers, and between them they were dragging a man who was bleeding profusely from multiple wounds across his body. I was too stunned to say anything, but the nurse who was with me was both rushing to help the officers and reprimanding them for dragging the poor guy. As the 3 of them carried the man into the back, the nurse told me that I needed to call the doctor right away. I was a little nervous at this. The doctor was always nice enough to me, but something about her always made me feel a little intimidated. I knew she had spent 6 years in the Army, and there was even an office rumor that she was still connected to the military. I called her number twice, but I never got an answer. I could hear commotion coming from the others in the back, so I threw my jacket on and I ran outside, next door to the doctor's house. I banged on the door sharply and I was caught off guard when the door almost immediately opened. The doctor was there, fully dressed and ready to go. She hardly greeted me as she walked past me, heading straight to the clinic, so I just followed her back next door and into the waiting room. The doctor immediately walked to the back of the clinic, and I went to one of the supply rooms to try to find something to clean up the blood near the front door. I found some gloves and disinfectant, and I was scrubbing hard when the doctor walked back in about 2 minutes later. When she saw me cleaning the blood, she told me to stop immediately and to leave it alone, that she would take care of it herself later. I started to protest. The idea of the doctor having to clean up that mess was absurd. But before I could say so, she held up her hand to stop me. And I remember what she said next with chilling clarity. "Lock the door," she said. "Lock it. Turn off all the lights in the front room and get behind the desk, out of sight. If anybody comes to the door, you are not to let them in, not for any reason. Do you understand me?" I guess I must have shown some sign of agreement, because after that, she just turned and returned to the back room. I was absolutely dumbfounded. I had no idea what she was talking about or why she would say any of that stuff. And I was pretty unnerved at that point. I ran around turning off the lights and locking the deadbolt on the front door. I ran back behind the desk and I crawled underneath it. My heart was racing and it was hard to keep my breathing steady. The clinic wasn't really big, but I hadn't seen the other nurse or either of the officers since they took the injured guy into the back room. I sat for what felt like an hour under the desk when a sudden banging on the front door scared the crap out of me. I almost got up to see who it was until I remembered what the doctor had said. I thought about peeking over the counter to see who it could be, but then I thought better of it. And honestly, I was too afraid to look anyway. At first, it seemed like the banging was coming from a single person. But after a few moments, it sounded like 2, and then 3. Until ultimately it sounded like half of the town was out there just banging on the glass doors. I was terrified, sitting crouched down with my head tucked between my legs. There were no voices or demands to be let inside, just rapid rhythmic banging. Nobody from the back came out, and I sat alone in the receptionist room, just waiting for the thunderous pounding at the door to break the glass. I can't tell you how long it went on for. At one point, I was certain I was losing my sanity when it just stopped. One moment it was absolute turmoil, and the next, complete silence. The new stillness was more unsettling than the pounding had been, to be honest. Only a few minutes later, there was another knock at the door, and I felt a pang of fear, thinking that whoever was out there had returned. But this time, I could hear voices on the other side. I was working up the courage to actually look this time when the doctor came bounding down the hallway to the front door. She unlocked it and threw it open. A stream of men rushed in, probably a dozen, all dressed in a type of military uniform that I couldn't recognize. A few were carrying what looked like medical instruments, while others were carrying assault rifles. It was chaotic, and I found myself being gently escorted outside into the back of a black SUV. 2 men sat in the front seat, and another sat next to me in the back. all dressed in the same military fatigues I had seen the other men wearing. The man sitting next to me in the back asked me to explain the night's events, and I did. At least the parts I could, anyway. He asked me a few questions, mostly about the pounding noise that I heard. I could tell he was trying to hide it, but when I told him it sounded like literally dozens of people, he became very concerned, almost frightened. When I was done, he thanked me politely and told the man at the wheel to drive me home, and he did. I never did give my address, but somehow they knew where my house was anyway. The next day, I received a visit at home from the man who had questioned me. He told me that the injured man had contracted a rare and infectious disease, and that everyone who had come into physical contact with him needed to be quarantined. The pounding I heard was a delusion brought on by the stress, and that I would soon receive a call from someone with the Department of Health with information on my indefinite paid leave of absence. And that was it. I haven't seen the doctor, the nurse, the injured man, or the officer since. And just like the man said, I received a call from somebody who claimed to be from the Department of Health. I've been placed on an indefinite leave of absence with full pay. The only restriction being that I don't discuss the incident with anybody. In the mid-2000s, I decided to join the Army. I guess at the time I thought it would be some kind of a grand adventure. I managed to make it through basic training and advanced individual training. I'm not going to lie though, it really kicked my butt. But I managed to get through it and I got sent to my first duty station. It was at the National Training Center for Pre-Deployment Training. I was issued supplies and a room and I tried to get myself settled in, but it wasn't an easy transition, and I felt uncomfortable there. The place just didn't seem right to me. I got into my room, and the first few nights were just strange. There was a weird energy there, and bizarre stuff kept happening. For example, my gear kept getting moved around. I'd find my things in the most random places, and the lights would often turn themselves on in the middle of the night, and I kept hearing weird groaning noises, stuff like that. I had been alone there for the first few days, but my roommate showed up at the end of the week. We had known each other during basic training, so it was nice to have somebody familiar around. I told him that I felt like somebody was messing around with me, and I warned him to watch his stuff. The first night he was there, we secured our room and our belongings and we went to sleep. We had to be up at 5:30 for physical training, but at around 1 in the morning, I woke up because my blanket had fallen off the bed. I was freezing, which was bizarre because we were in the South and it was the summer, so it's always hot. So I got down to get my blanket and I glanced over to notice that my wardrobe doors were open. I went and I closed them and then got back into bed. I fell asleep again, but then not much later, something woke me up again. I sat up and now saw that all my stuff, and also my roommate's stuff, had been tossed around the room. I woke up my roommate and he was really irritated. Anyway, we got our stuff picked up and I went back to bed, but I got woken up yet again, and now it felt like we weren't alone. Luckily, I could hear my roommate snoring, so I knew he was in his bed, where he should be. But that's when I saw the light from the fridge in the kitchenette shining into the room. I could also see that somebody had the fridge door open and they were looking inside. It was a soldier, and now it was freezing again. I was about to call out to the soldier, but that's when I watched as he turned around. And it took a minute for my eyes to adjust to the light, but then I started to recognize the gear that he had on. He was loaded up with combat gear and wearing fatigues and boots. I mean, he looked ready for war. When I looked at his face, he slowly turned it in the other direction, and I was shocked at what I saw. Half of his head and helmet were gone, like they had been blown off. I was petrified at that point, but I watched as he closed the fridge and walked across the room to the door and walked out. I was at a complete loss for words. Obviously, that couldn't have been real. I knew that it was a dream. but my mind was racing and I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. I didn't even wake my roommate up. It was all too bizarre. I showed up to PT and the acting first sergeant could tell that I wasn't myself. He actually said, "You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost broke my concentration and told him what had happened, but I contained myself and I told him that I was fine. But then about halfway through PT, he came up to me again and asked what was going on. I guess I wasn't hiding it as well as I thought I was. I told him I just hadn't been able to sleep that night. But then after PT ended, he pulled me out and said that I should just speak up and whatever I said would be off the record. I told him that if I told him what happened, he would think I was crazy. He told me again that I should trust him, and he assured me that it would be off the record. I started telling him what happened, but when I got to the part about the soldier's head being half blown off, his face got pale, and he was quiet. He said, "Who put you up to this? Do you think this is funny?" For some reason, he was really put off by my story, and my impression was that he thought I was trying to put one over on him. But I had no idea what he was talking about. "Put me up to this?" I asked. I swore to him that I wasn't lying and that I had seen this apparition, and that it had completely freaked me out. And then he told me to follow him. He took me to the command office where I had never been. He unlocked a door in the back, and I followed him into a room where the commander's desk was. There were some portraits on the wall, and he pointed to one. It immediately gave me chills. Plain as day, I was looking at a portrait of the soldier I had seen. I just said, "That's him." The sergeant told me who he was. He was a corporal in the unit's first deployment to Iraq. He had died in an IED attack that took off part of his head. Apparently, I was the first soldier to be assigned the room I was in since it had belonged to the deceased corporal. I was floored. I didn't know what to say. The sergeant then told me stories about who that soldier was and how well liked he had been. I think at that moment I completely realized how tragic war really is. I deployed with that unit a few months later, and I spent a year fighting in that horrible place. I had some really close calls, and each one of them made me think of that corporal. I've survived more things than most people can imagine, and obviously I managed to make it home, but I don't take anything for granted anymore. I started working in IT shortly after my first post-grad internship ended. I had been a computer science major, but I figured that I had to pay a couple of dues before being able to open and run the business that I had always dreamed of. So I was working with this temp agency, and I kind of shuddered knowing how overqualified I was to be working amongst the other temps. Seriously, this was intended as a baby step. They set me up at this printing company that I had never heard of. I was planning on staying for less than a year so I could just get some real-world experience for my resume. But it was hard to even think about sticking it out, even from that very first day. There was only one other person who worked in the IT department, and they scared the hell out of me. He probably was once a promising young professional with big dreams and high ambitions, but was now a sappy, middle-aged IT guy who always looked miserable. I tried my best not to engage with him too much. The possibility of ending up like him was too much to even consider, too. But I wasn't there to make any friends, so I won't deny the fact that I was a little less than friendly. Our department was essentially just a tiny dark office with 2 desks. We had to spend a lot of time shut in that room together, so whenever there was a service request, I jumped at the opportunity to solve it. A few months into things, I finally learned a little bit about my coworker. He had been a lot like me when he was my age, so I asked him why he never moved on from the job. Apparently, he thought I was just a gullible idiot and told me some hokey legend about this apparent entity down in the basement. He said that when he first started working there, his coworker told him about it. So when he saw the thing in the basement, it scared him so much to the point that he couldn't leave. Some hybrid of Stockholm Syndrome or an utter BS is what I thought it was. I just rolled my eyes and sarcastically thanked him for the honesty. But He insisted that he wasn't fibbing, and he just told me that if I wanted, I could go check it out for myself. I scoffed. I was a well-educated, soon-to-be professional, not some small-town ghost hunter. But he was adamant that he was being truthful. So with a hefty groan and an urge to put a stop to it, I obliged. I grabbed a small flashlight that I kept in my desk drawer, and I headed down to the basement. I hadn't spent much, if any, time down there. As far as I could tell, it was just another storage vessel for the company. I had seen my coworker go down a few times for extra paper and staples, but that was it. The building we worked in was small, 2 levels with an added basement, no elevator. I kicked open the door to the staircase leading down. The smell was immediately dank and musty. It reminded me of a sweaty gym bag or a mildewy towel. I flicked my flashlight on in front of me and headed down the stairs. There was a ton of surplus crap everywhere, ceiling-high towers of cardboard boxes, and the room itself was rectangular with this concrete divider between the front and the far side. I let my flashlight roam over the walls in the front half of the basement. Nothing was out of the ordinary, just poorly organized and overstuffed. The basement could really stand to hire an organizer or something, or a maid at least. I shuffled over to the concrete divider, and an unexpected wave of apprehension passed over me. I shook it off, and I rounded the divider to the other side. There were a few towering piles of boxes in the darkest, furthest corner, and 2 desks, almost identical to those upstairs. I glided the flashlight over them. Yes, they were the exact same desks as upstairs, but these were covered in years of dust and grime. When my flashlight slid from the desk surface to the negative space next to it, I almost lost it. My flashlight shone directly into 2 milky, dead eyes, staring directly at me. I jumped. I dropped the flashlight, sending it rattling to the floor. When it stopped, it cast a steady beam of light from the floor, and it illuminated 2 skeletal, slimy-looking feet poking out of the darkness. The light stopped at the creature's shins, showcasing the oily gray skin covering the malnourished body. With shaking fingers, I reached out for the flashlight. A hand then appeared from the darkness and grabbed my wrist. I wanted to scream, but when I tried, I physically could not. It was as if the thing's touch had silenced me. The skin was cold and sick with I don't even want to know with what. It couldn't have been good. And as its grasp on my wrist began to tighten, I knew I needed to break free. It started to pull me closer to the corner, into the darkness. This horrible hooting sound echoed through the basement. It sounded like it was closing in on me. So with all the strength that I could muster, I yanked my wrist from the hold, and I heard the sound of its body crashing into the tower of boxes. I grabbed my flashlight and I ran from the sounds. I made it up the stairs and I slammed the door shut. When I returned to my little office, my face said it all. My coworker even had the nerve to laugh out loud, knowing what had happened. I knew I couldn't say anything. I didn't even make a noise for the rest of the day, and I'm only now sharing this with you. I did leave that job the next week. I just couldn't handle looking into that coworker's face, knowing what he knew and what he had sent me to. Anyway, luckily I found you, and now I feel that I can share this story in this safe space that you offer. Thank you for that. My father was a professional hunter. Not so professional that my family was rich per se, but professional enough that he would be sponsored by local Minnesota shops to hunt with and promote their newest gear, rifles, and camping equipment. Naturally, I went hunting with him nearly every other weekend since I was a little boy. Some trips were short, lasting only a few hours, while others were extensive and warranted me skipping school on a Friday or a Monday. Those were always my favorite. One particular hunting trip in September, I remember being especially stoked. Not only were we heading out on a Friday, meaning I would have to make up the math test I had not been studying for all week, but we were planning to do an overnight in some cool caves along the river. I excitedly packed up my gear, triple-checked that my flashlight had batteries, and I sat patiently at the kitchen table, while my dad scrambled to get the rest of everything together. When it was time to leave, we both kissed Mom goodbye and headed out. I remember the air was crisp, and it certainly was feeling like fall outside. We met up with a couple of my dad's buddies who were headed in a similar direction as us for their hunting trip. We drove for forever to what felt like the middle of nowhere before leaving the car on the side of the wooded road. My dad's friends headed one way, eager to hunt down a herd of moose, while my father and I went in the opposite direction. We all agreed to meet up at the car tomorrow morning to regroup before heading back out for the day. And with those parting words, it was just me and my dad against the world. I thought the car ride out to the woods was long, but our walk to get where we were staying was even longer. My legs felt like they would collapse by the time we started slowing up, and at this point, it must have been late afternoon. We had stopped a few times here and there for snacks and a bathroom break, but I was ready to sit down, relax, and soak in the scenery. By the time night had come around, my dad and I had seen a beaver, bobcat, herd of deer, and what we think was a black bear off in the distance. All of this felt pretty substantial to me, and with that, I was ready to call it a night. That's when we headed into the depths of the cave that we got to call home for the night, and we set up a small fire to keep warm. I was passed out in no time. I can't tell you how long I was asleep because out there I had no recollection of time. All I know is that at some point in the middle of the night, I was woken up by the most demonic of screeches. My father must have had his hunter's instincts on because he was already up and alert by the time I even opened my eyes. When I went to ask him what the noise was, he quickly hushed me with a panicked look in his eyes. That scared me. He dropped down to my level, telling me to stay where I was before he slowly started making his way through the tunnel of the cave towards the entrance. I did as I was told for a minute or two before the fear overtook me and I wanted to be with my dad. Against his advisement, I got up and I began quickly making my way through the cave in an attempt to catch up with him. Long before I saw my dad or anything strange, the smell surrounded me. It was as though I was surrounded by dead animals, rotting away, and filling the air with the most vile stench. The fear that smell instilled within me caused me to pick up my pace. My anxiety relieved ever so slightly when my father's silhouette came into view, and before I knew it, I was wrapping my arms around his waist. He didn't move or respond to my presence, at which point I peered around his rigid body. And that's when all the anxiety that had escaped me came flooding back. Standing there, nearly 10 feet tall, was the embodiment of my nightmares. It had the face of a deer, but really there wasn't much of a face to it at all. Just a skull, rather. It had piercing yellow eyes, the sharpest antlers I've ever seen, and its skin looked as though it was practically falling off its bones. I was certain that whatever this creature was, it had made the noise that woke me from my sleep. I didn't waste any time shaking my dad to his senses, crying for him to run back into the cave with me. Instantly, he snapped from his haze, raised his rifle, and shot at the animal a handful of times. The creature retreated slightly, at which point my dad threw me over his shoulder and sprinted back into the cave. As we made our way back into the cave, time seemed to move in slow motion. Slung over my dad's shoulder, I watched as the beast let out a final harrowing howl before sprinting out of view, out the cave's entrance. By the time we made it back to our camping gear, my father quickly smothered the remains of our bonfire, and he huddled me into the corner of the cave with him. We stayed there, silent. I was trembling. It seemed like hours. At some point, I fell asleep in my dad's arms, but something tells me he stayed awake all night. At the first sign of light, he shook me awake, and we hurriedly packed up our belongings and inched our way out of the cave to be sure the coast was clear. We made it back to the car in a fraction of the time it took us to get to the cave, and we were thankful to find my dad's friends were already there. It's been years now, but my dad has yet to go on another overnight camping trip. As you may be able to imagine, I had no interest in accompanying him on trips thereafter. In some respects, I miss the times we would spend together out there in the woods, but to be honest, our bond is even stronger now. It's held together by this memory of something much, much more sinister. Hi there. I'm writing to you because I noticed some people with similar stories, and it kind of motivated me to finally share mine. I'm usually a little self-conscious about telling it because of the absurdity of the whole thing, but this is anonymous anyway, so here goes. I'm from California, but from a more northern, suburban area outside of the major cities. My friends and I love to go hiking and sightseeing and things like that in our spare time, mostly because it's just about the only thing in California you can do for free. Once, though, we had this insane run-in with the most unexplainable creature. My friends and I took our van out a bit to go exploring. We brought food, some beer, a speaker. It was all set up to be a really great day, and it was, at first. We found a spot to park and we set up this really cool picnic area and we started playing some tunes. And then one of my friends said that there was this other amazing area up ahead for photos. So we all hopped right on that and stupidly left all of our stuff behind. We couldn't have been gone for more than an hour, maybe even less. But despite that, it was long enough for us to return to an absolutely demolished display. Nobody touched our van itself, which was odd because the keys were in the ignition, and it could have been easily stolen. But aside from the van, everything else was ruined. The most noticeable thing that we made a note of as we observed the wreckage was this nasty stench. It kind of smelled like a wet dog, or like how everybody smells right after gym class in the locker room. Just straight, gross BO, combined with what could only be described as urine stink. Also, much to our dismay, the food was completely gone. All that remained was a few crumbs, barely enough to even make me think any food was there to begin with. Whoever did this was definitely hungry. And then the next thing, the weirdest thing in my opinion, is that the speaker we had, the one that was playing music, was destroyed, ripped entirely in half. And yes, I said ripped. It was like somebody had just picked it up and snapped it in half. That was freaky. Freaky for a number of reasons. First off, what thing has the strength and hand structure necessary to grab something of that size and just snap it? And secondly, it was honestly just kind of frightening, the whole thing. And it didn't help that it was an expensive speaker, too. So now we're all just kind of registering and processing what we saw because there's only a few possibilities. We weren't gone very long, so whoever did it was definitely still around, in the nearby vicinity. Some of us were really panicked, shaking, freaking out. Others, like myself, were just sort of confused and wanted to know what exactly happened, because it didn't add up to anything remotely explainable. So the ever-brave person that I am, I decided I should look around and investigate. I figured it was just an animal. What's it going to do if there's like 5 humans surrounding it? It's gonna get scared and run off. That's what I was thinking. So there couldn't be too much to be worried about. But looking back, I was really wrong. We're looking, and there's no sign of much of anything anywhere around us. And then as we're following a trail, we see something. Footprints on the ground, in the mud. And then now this is the part of the story that sounds the most far-fetched, I think, just because of how stereotypical it is. But when we looked at those footprints, we saw feet that were significantly larger than any person's feet could naturally grow. They were, as the term originates, big feet. So now I think we're either being pranked or we're in some serious trouble looking for something that obviously has no interest in being found. I told my friends that if the thing wanted to attack us, it would have by now. If it wanted us to see it, it would have made itself visible. So our day absolutely ruined. We all started packing up what remained of our stuff to get in the van and get the heck out of there. Now I'd like to say that that was the end and that we didn't notice anything, but I did. I didn't want to freak out my friends, and I also didn't want to call attention to it, but I saw the creature. Not for more than a minute and not for more than a glance, but I did get a decent look as it stood there observing us from a distance. It was gigantic, nearly as tall as some of the bushes it was trying to hide behind, like maybe 9 feet tall. It was clearly hiding and maybe even scared, so I didn't feel afraid. In fact, I sort of wished I could have made some kind of contact with it somehow. It was furry, head to toe furry, like an animal, but its limbs and its head shape and facial features, they were all sort of human. Kind of human. It had kind of beady little eyes and a sort of pin head, but it still had this energy about it like it knew what was happening. And it was also completely ripped with muscles. I definitely knew in that moment how it was able to rip apart that speaker so easily. So after I was half satisfied, half shocked enough from looking at it, I turned away and just continued to help clean up, acting like nothing had happened. I honestly never told my friends I got that look at it, and I don't know if I ever will. But the thing is, I wouldn't mind if I did run into it again. Maybe it was nice, and I'm curious. I'd really like to know more about it. When I was growing up, I spent a lot of time down the shore, specifically Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. My family owned a small vacation home along the Indian River Bay. Over the years, I had a few run-ins with some interesting characters. I had spent a lot of time wandering around the maze of marshes and wetlands, and I knew my way around pretty well. I even had a secret place that I would go to crab. A small channel from the bay emptied into a deceptively deep lagoon, and I would sometimes leave a crab pot or two in the water and return the next day to a decent catch. The summer of the first incident, there was a scandal sweeping the bay. Someone, or a group of someones, were stealing crabs from the crab pots. A lot of people supplemented their income from selling the crabs, and some even fully sustained themselves. There were patrols from the bay constables and even some vigilante locals who were up in arms. It was all just cool background noise for me. I didn't really care if people were stealing crabs. Besides, I had my secret spot. And that's where it happened. The day before, I had left 2 pots in my lagoon. One at the mouth where the inlet runs in, and the other further back in deeper water. I was returning late in the evening, an hour or 2 before dark, to check my pots. The area around the lagoon was overgrown with tall marsh grass, and it almost was impossible to see more than a few feet. But as I got close to the lagoon, I began hearing some very strange sounds. The first was a splashing noise, like somebody was jumping into the water of the lagoon and splashing around. That would not have been a good idea. Besides the nasty muddy water and eels, there were plenty of snapping turtles in the water that could literally take a finger off. I heard the noise multiple times, so I guess there was more than one person. The other sound was the croaking of bullfrogs, and they must have been big. Now I was really baffled. Frogs didn't live near salt water, at least not around here, and even if they were, there was no way they could have been big enough to make that splashing noise I was hearing. Quietly moving the last few yards to the edge of the lagoon, I parted some marsh grass to look through, and I was thoroughly stupefied at what I saw. I can only describe them as, and I know how this sounds, but as frog people. There were 3 of them, all a shade of deep green with varying patterns of dark splotches and ridges running along their bodies. The one who was standing was a little over 3 feet high. The other was wallowing in the lagoon, while the third was crouched down in shallower water, fiddling with something. It was my crab pot. As I watched in fascination, the creature with my crab pot managed to pull the bungee cord around and get the pot open. The one watching from the shore began croaking in excitement and picked up what looked like a small reed basket that was lying on the ground next to it. I watched as they emptied the contents of the pot into the basket, and then the second creature actually closed the pot back up and put it back in the water where they found it. The third creature that had been lazily swimming around eventually made its way over to the deeper of the 2 pots, and then it dove under the water and came back up a moment later, thrumming to its partners. And that's the point when I heard something behind me. I whipped around and I came face to face with a 4th creature that looked just as surprised to see me. It was shorter than the others, and it had a squiggling eel in one hand. I was too in awe of this bizarre scene to really do anything, Just staring at this thing that shouldn't exist had me confused. It let out a pair of rapid, high-pitched croaks, and then it bounded off through the thick marsh grass. I turned back to the lagoon just as the last of the creatures disappeared under the water. 3 rings of ripples echoing where they made their escape, and then they were gone. Who would ever believe something so asinine as frog people? Still, I tried to tell my parents, but they just thought I was being funny. I was 13 at the time, and I wasn't an overly imaginative kid. So when I insisted that I was telling the truth, my parents really started getting upset. They started asking all kinds of questions like, what was I doing? So I just dropped the whole thing. But I never forgot. Over the next few years, I always tried to find more evidence of these creatures. I was afraid to talk about it with anyone for fear of seeming crazy. And the internet was a pit of conflicting information and tall tales. But eventually, I did find more evidence. I had borrowed my neighbor's canoe for the day, and I was paddling around some of the backwater, not too far from the lagoon where I had first seen them. As I came around a bend in the tight channel, I almost ran the bow of the canoe right into the head of one of them. It must have just been treading water, and it dipped below the surface before I could even react. But it was definitely one of those same creatures. The last time I had any kind of an encounter with them was right in that same lagoon. I never saw it again, and so that day I just headed back home and didn't think about it again. I think that was the last time I had any kind of an encounter with them, right there. Anyway, my family was selling their shore house and then purchasing a new one in Ocean City, Maryland. I figured I would never be back in this spot again, but I wanted to take it all in one more time. So one last time, I made the trek to the lagoon. And I was just kind of poking around when I saw a bunch of small shapes darting around in the water. They were too small to be the creatures I had seen before, and I thought that maybe they were eels, but I wanted to investigate. I headed over to get a better look. They were tadpoles, but the biggest tadpoles I had ever seen. Each was about 6 or 8 inches long, and there were dozens of them. I considered taking one of them, but my conscience wouldn't allow me to do it. So I just let them be, and that was the last I ever had any interaction with these mysterious creatures. I'm not going to give any details on where exactly this lagoon is. I think that these things just want to be left in peace, and I'm going to respect that.